I'm Jeremy. Today is day 73 of reading. Today we're reading Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. We're on page 78. Maybe he's left, said Harry, because he missed out on the Defense Against Dark Arts job again. Or maybe he might have been stacked, said Ron enthusiastically. I mean, everyone hates him. Or maybe, said a very cold voice right behind them, he's waiting to hear why you two didn't arrive on the school train. Harry spun around. There, his black robes rippling in the cold breeze, stood Severus Snape. He was a thin man with sallow skin, a hooked nose, and greasy, shoulder-length black hair. And at this moment, he was smiling in a way that told Harry he and Ron were in very deep trouble. Follow me, said Snape. Not daring to even look at each other, Harry and Ron followed Snape up the steps into the vast, echoing entrance hall, which was lit with flaming torches. A delicious smell of food was wafting from the great hall, but Snape led them away from the wormers and light down a narrow stone staircase that led into the dungeons. In, he said, opening the door halfway down the cold passageway and pointing. They entered Snape's office, shivering. The shadowy walls were lined with shelves of large glass jars, which floated in all manner of revolting things Harry didn't really want to know the name at the moment. The fireplace was dark and empty. Snape closed the door and turned to look at them. So, he said softly, the train isn't good enough for the famous Harry Potter and his faithful sidekick Weasley. Wants to arrive with a bang. Did we, boys? No, sir. It was at King's Cross. Silence, said Snape coldly. What have you done with the car? Ron gulped. This wasn't the first time Snape had given Harry the impression of being able to read minds. But a moment later, he understood. As Snape unrolled today's issue of the Evening Prophet. You were seen, he hissed, showing them the headline, Flying Fort Angelia, Mystifies Muggles. He began to read aloud. 2 Muggles in London, convinced they saw an old car flying over the post office tower at noon in Norfolk. Mrs. Haddie Bayliss, while hanging out her washing, Mr. Angus Fleer of Peebles reported to the police. 6 or 7 Muggles in all. I believe your father works in the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office, he said, looking at Ron and smiling still more nastily. Dear, his own son. Harry felt as though he'd just been walloped in the stomach by one of the mad tree's larger branches. If anyone found out Mr. Weasley had bewitched the car, he hadn't thought of that. I noticed, in my search of the park, that considerable damage seems to have done to the very valuable Whomping Willow. Snape went on. That tree did more damage to us than we... Ron blurted out. Silence, snapped Snape again. Most unfortunately, you are not in my house, and the decision to expel you does not rest with me. I shall go and fetch the people who do have that happy power. You will wait here. Harry and Ron stared at each other, white-faced. Harry didn't feel hungry anymore. He now felt extremely sick. He tried not to look at the large, slimy something suspended in green liquid on a shelf behind Snape's desk. If Snape had gone to fetch Professor McGonagall, head of Gryffindor House, they were hardly any better off. She might be fair by Snape, but she was still extremely strict. 10 minutes later, Snape returned, and sure enough, it was Professor McGonagall who accompanied him. Harry had seen Professor McGonagall angry on several occasions, but neither had he seen her this angry before. She raised her wand the moment she entered. Harry and Ron both flinched, but she merely pointed it at the empty fireplace, where flames suddenly erupted. "Sit," she said, and they both backed into chairs by the fire. "Explain," she said, her glasses glinting ominously. Ron launched into the story, starting with the barrier at the station refusing to let them through. "So we had no choice, Professor. We couldn't get on the train." "Why didn't you send us a letter by owl? I believe you have an owl," Professor McGonagall said coldly to Harry. Harry gaped at her. Now she said it, that seemed the obvious thing to have done. I didn't think." "That," said Professor McGonagall, "is obvious." There was a knock on the office door, and Snape, now looking happier than ever, opened it. There stood the headmaster, Professor Dumbledore. Harry's whole body went numb. Dumbledore was looking unusually grave. He stared down his very crooked nose at them, and Harry suddenly found himself wishing he and Ron were still being beaten up by the Whomping Willow. There was a long silence. Then Dumbledore said, "Please explain why you did this." Would it have been better if he had shouted? Harry hated the disappointment in his voice. For some reason, he was unable to look Dumbledore in the eyes, and spoke instead to his niece. He told Dumbledore everything except that Mr. Weasley owned this bewitched car, making it sound as though he and Ron had happened to find a flying car parked outside the station. He knew Dumbledore would see through this at once, but Dumbledore asked no questions about the car. When Harry had finished, he merely continued to peer at them through his spectacles. "We'll go and get our stuff," said Ron in a hopeless sort of voice. "What are you talking about, Weasley?" barked Professor McGonagall. "Well, you're expelling us, aren't you?" said Ron. Harry looked quickly at Dumbledore. "Not today, Mr. Weasley," said Dumbledore, "but I must impress upon both of you the seriousness of what you have done. I will be writing to both of your families tonight. I must also warn you that if you do anything like that again, I will have no choice but to expel you." Snape looked as though Christmas had been cancelled. He cleared his throat and said, "Professor Dumbledore, these boys have flouted the decree for restriction of underage wizardry, caused serious damage to an old and valuable tree. Surely acts of this nature It would be for Professor McGonagall to decide on these boys' punishment, Severus," said Dumbledore calmly. "They are in her house and are therefore her responsibility." He turned to Professor McGonagall. "I must go back to the feast, Minerva. I've got to give out a few notices." "Come, Severus, there is a delicious-looking custard tart I want to sample." Snape shot a look of pure venom at Harry and Ron as he allowed himself to be swept out of his office, leaving them alone with Professor McGonagall, who was still eyeing them like a wrathful eagle. "You better get along to the hospital, Wink, Weasley. You're bleeding." "Not much," said Ron, hastily wiping the cut over his eyes with his sleeve. "Professor, I wanted to watch my sister being sorted." "The sorting ceremony is over," said Professor McGonagall. "Your sister is also in Gryffindor." "Oh, good," said Ron. "And speaking of Gryffindor," Professor McGonagall said sharply, but Harry cut in. "Professor, when we took the car, Turnhead had started. So Gryffindor shouldn't really have points taken from it, should it?" he finished, watching her anxiously. Professor McGonagall gave him a piercing look, but he was sure she had almost smiled. Her mouth looked less thin. "Anyway, I will not take any points from Gryffindor," she said, and Harry's heart lightened considerably. "But you will both get detention." It was better than Harry had expected. As for Dumbledore's writing to the Dursleys, it was nothing. Harry knew perfectly that they'd just be disappointed that the Whomping Willow hadn't squashed him flat. Thank you, everyone. That's all for today. Bye. See you tomorrow.